Have you ever noticed that a lot of stories about the future look strangely familiar? Deserts, the bounty hunters, the outlaws, the dust. Whether it's the Mandalorian, The Last of Us, Blade Runner, Westworld, or even Star Wars, for some reason the future keeps dressing up like the past. Why does so much sci-fi feel like a western? Why are spaceports always dusty, freedom always dangerous, and justice always personal? Maybe it's not just a stylistic choice. Maybe our vision of tomorrow keeps recycling the Wild West because we secretly know that's where we're heading. In this video, we are going to uncover the hidden code behind futuristic cowboy stories and ask the question no one's prepared for. What if the Wild West isn't behind us, but ahead? When could we expect it to happen? And if it does, what can you do today to prepare for a world with no rules? So saddle up, I actually never sat on a horse before in my life, and let's find out.
Consider again that dot. That's here. That's all. That's us. Now I've become them. Ready? Wake up.
From the high noon duels of classic westerns to the high orbit shootouts of science fiction, our stories keep returning to the frontier myth. And it's proven irresistibly enduring. Few images tug at the imagination like a lone cowboy against the sunset. And it turns out that vision has ridden right into our depiction of the future. It raises an intriguing question. Why does the Wild West keep reappearing in sci-fi? Let's round up some examples to see just how pervasive this cowboy motive really is. One of the earliest space westerns was actually Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry famously pitched the original Star Trek series as a wagon trail to the stars, essentially a western in space. This vision, the Starship Enterprise wandering from planet to planet, wasn't so different from a stagecoach rolling between frontier towns. Each new world was a frontier, each encounter a potential shootout or peace treaty. The formula worked because it tapped into a spirit audiences instinctively recognized. The excitement and danger of the untamed frontier. In other words, the final frontier of space borrowed a lot from the Old West, and Star Trek was just the beginning. Star Wars took the cowboy vibe and ran with it at light speed. If you think about it, the desert planet Tatooine, with its dusty cantinas full of outlaws and its lawless outskirts, practically scream Wild West. Han Solo, who by the way shot first, and his quick-draw blaster swagger and gunslinger confidence, straight out of a western. The most explicit embrace of this motive is the recent Star Wars hit The Mandalorian, which doubles down on the space western aesthetic. It's basically a Clint Eastwood spaghetti western set in a galaxy far, far away. Speeder bikes instead of horses, blasters instead of six-shooters. The show takes place in the lawless Outer Rim territories, a Blackwater rife with criminals, loners, and other desperados, where any semblance of government rarely reaches. The titular Mandalorian himself is a mysterious bounty hunter with no name. It's a direct homage to Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. A silent gunslinger who roams lawless lands, enforces justice on his own terms, and disappears into legend. And just like him, the Mandalorian is drifting through seedy frontier towns, well, spaceports, and dealing out justice with cool, silent efficiency. The series revels in Western motives. It even opens with a twangy Old West-style theme music and introduces characters straight out of a frontier town. We meet humble villagers defending their homes against raiders, ruthless bandits terrorizing locals, and even a taciturn vapor farmer seeking solitude on the frontier. Every episode feels like it could end with a showdown at high noon. By leaning so hard into the Wild West aesthetic, The Mandalorian isn't just giving us nostalgia, it's proving that the cowboy mythos is alive and well in modern imagination. Another fan-favorite example of the future western is Firefly, Joss Whedon's cult classic TV series. Firefly basically asked, what if space colonization felt just like the Old West? The show's world building answers that brilliantly. In the Firefly universe, humanity expanded into new star systems, terraforming planets one by one. And every time a new world was made livable, the authorities would dump a handful of settlers there and expect them to build a civilization from scratch. The result? Isolated frontier towns on distant planets with minimal law or oversight. An echo of how American pioneers set up boomtowns in the Wild West. It makes perfect sense. If humans became pioneers in space, their settlements would develop much like the 19th century frontier towns. In other words, Firefly's core concept was that the future could rhyme with the past. The show wears this concept on its sleeve. Characters dress in cowboy dusters, swear in Mandarin Chinese, fly spacecrafts, wield revolvers alongside laser pistols, and drink in saloons on backwater moons. It's an impressive blend of future tech and frontier spirit that resonates on a gut level, because we've seen that pioneer story before. Interestingly, the space western idea wasn't unique to Whedon. Halfway across the world, the Japanese anime Cowboy Bebop was treading similar ground at around the same time. The title itself shouts cowboy. Can't really miss it. Cowboy Bebop follows a crew of bounty hunters roaming a future solar system in a beat-up spaceship. While it doesn't lay out the frontier politics as explicitly as Firefly, it oozes Western style. Gunslinging duels on asteroid colonies, twangy jazz music, and lone wolf characters with moral codes reminiscent of Western drifters. Watching Spike Spiegel, the show's cool-as-ice anti-hero, stroll into a bar on Mars with a pistol on his hip feels just like Clint Eastwood entering a saloon. It's the Wild West transposed into the cosmos, and it works. In fact, it works so well that Firefly and Cowboy Bebop, two productions from totally different cultures, independently arrived at the same creative destination. This convergence suggests there's something universal about the frontier mythos, a kind of storytelling gold that creators everywhere recognize. The post-apocalyptic chaos of Mad Max, that's basically a neo-western with cars and gasoline. Warlords rule the wastelands like gunslinging outlaws, and water is as precious as gold in the barren desert. The game Fallout New Vegas explicitly mixes retro futurism with a Majove desert cowboy vibe. Sure, you've got plasma rifles and mutant critters, but you've also got revolvers, saloons, and a good old-fashioned tussle over New Vegas, just like an Old West boomtown. Even futures after the apocalypse turn into Western. HBO's The Last of Us essentially plays out like a gritty frontier saga. A hardened drifter, Joel, guides a young charge, Ellie, across a lawless wilderness. It's the lone cowboy story dressed up with mushroom zombies and broken highways. And then there's HBO's Westworld, which literally starts in a Wild West themed park before turning the concept inside out. Westworld gives us a future where wealthy people play cowboy in a perfect replica of an Old West town populated by android hosts. But here's the twist. The androids have been programmed with classic Western archetypes, the farm girl, the gunslinger, the brothel madame with a heart of gold, and used as playthings in a consequence-free frontier fantasy. Yet even these synthetic beings can't resist the call for the Wild West mythos. The spirit of the frontier awakens in them, and eventually the androids revolt, throwing off their figurative yoke of servitude and head to new frontiers. It's as if the very idea of the Wild West contains a rebel spark that refuses to stay tamed. Westworld becomes a meta-commentary on the Western myth itself. It suggests that this mythic setting is a battleground of terror and freedom, a double-edged symbol used by the powerful to glorify violence, even as the oppressed seize on it for inspiration to rise up. In short, the Western is more than old history. It's a primal story of freedom versus law, chaos versus civilization that still punches us in the gut. No wonder it keeps sneaking into our visions of the future. So why do these frontier themes resonate so deeply even in stories about tomorrow? Well, partly because the Western is America's foundational myth, and through Hollywood it became a global myth. The cowboy stands as a symbol of ultimate individualism, romantic and a little tragic. It's the fantasy of a world where your fate is truly in your own hands. Life is uncertain, but freedom is absolute. Opportunity is endless, but so are the dangers. As one cultural critic noted in Our Modern Imagination, the Western milieu is a blend of terror and freedom. It represents a place where might can equal right, for better or worse, and where justice isn't handed down by institutions, but by individuals with their courage or guns to enforce it. Iranian artist Farhad Moshiri, who grew up on Hollywood westerns, observed that cowboy imagery is how Americans want to be seen, how they advertise themselves. And importantly, the world isn't finished with this imagery. It keeps resurfacing because it lets us talk about the past and present at the same time. In his words, Western archetypes may be caricatures, but they contain truths that still resonate, illustrating a caricature version of America that speaks of the past and the present at the same time. They're larger-than-life symbols of things we still grapple with. Law versus lawlessness, freedom versus security, the known versus the unknown, and that's powerful stuff. It's telling how often we use the phrase Wild West to describe any new, untamed domain. The early internet of the 1990s, frequently dubbed the Wild West of the web, full of anarchic chat rooms and digital outlaws. Cryptocurrency in the 2010s, same thing, a wild west of unregulated coins and scam artists. Whenever we face something new and unruly, a technology, a market, a frontier, we instinctively reach for the old frontier metaphors. It's our cultural shorthand for "no rules here yet, folks." So naturally, when pop culture imagines future frontiers, whether on Mars, in cyberspace, or in some dystopian wasteland, the storytellers often borrow the language and imagery of the Old West. It's the perfect way to signal to the audience that in this setting the normal rules don't apply. Here be dragons, here life is up for grabs and only the bold or lucky survive. The bottom line is that pop culture loves turning the future into a Wild West because it scratches a deep itch in our collective psyche. The Wild West myth is equal parts hopeful, anyone can start fresh on the frontier, and cautionary. Without law, things can get scary fast. It lets us explore human drama in its rawest form. No wonder our sci-fi and fantasy creators keep returning to that well, dressing up space captains as cowboys or making AI robots into outlaws or turning hackers into high-tech gunslingers. As the saying goes, there's a little cowboy in all of us. Now, it's fun to see cowboys riding throughout our favorite sci-fi stories and into the cyber sunset. But here's the real question nagging at us. Is all this just escapism and metaphor, or could our actual future start looking a lot like a Wild West reboot? Strap on your 6-shooter or, your smartphone, because next we're investigating whether the real world of the 21st century might echo that untamed frontier. The idea that the future will resemble the Wild West seems far-fetched. We live in a world of smartphones and satellites, not saloons and stagecoaches, right? Yet there are compelling reasons to believe that the decades ahead will indeed echo the rough and tumble frontier in surprising ways. In fact, some of those reasons are unfolding already. First, new physical frontiers are appearing on our horizon. Places where law and infrastructure haven't caught up, just like the American West in the 1800s. The most obvious example is outer space. After years of dreams and planning, we're finally on the cusp of real space colonization. Private companies are launching rockets, planning moon bases, even talking seriously about Mars missions. In just the first few months of 2025, there's been a flurry of private space ventures, some successful, some exploding in specular fashion. The problem? Our laws and treaties about space are decades out of date. The current international space agreements were written in the 1960s and 70s, back when only a couple of superpower governments were playing the game. Those treaties never anticipated Elon Musk launching mega rockets or startups landing robots on asteroids. Without updated rules, experts warn that space could become a kind of Wild West. A lawless vacuum where tech billionaires and private corporations do as they please with little accountability or regard for the common good. Sound familiar? That's the same scenario as the 19th century gold rush. Ambitious folks racing into an untamed land, and for a while, might makes right. Imagine the first Mars colony set up by a private company. Who's the governor there? Probably the CEO. If two rival companies start mining the same asteroid, who settles that dispute? Right now, nobody really knows. Under the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, no country can claim a celestial body as its territory. Mars, for instance, is explicitly not subject to national appropriation by any sovereign nation. And if, say, American citizens build a Mars outpost, the US is supposed to retain jurisdiction over them according to that treaty. Each state continues to have jurisdiction over its launched space objects and personnel. But those rules were crafted for an era of governments in space, not freewheeling entrepreneurs. In practice, if a maverick millionaire sets up a Martian city and declares himself mayor or emperor, Earth governments might struggle to enforce their laws millions of miles away. Until effective interplanetary regulations and enforcement arrive, which could take a long time, early space settlers will essentially be living in a frontier environment, isolated, dangerous, and largely on their own. They'll have to jury-rig solutions to survive, defend their outposts from hazards, environmental or human, and probably craft their own makeshift codes of conduct. That's Frontier Living 101. Space, the final frontier, might actually be a frontier in the Wild West sense, at least for a transitional period. Space isn't the only frontier. Right here on Earth, technology is creating new wild spaces. Domains where norms and regulations haven't settled and where individuals can act with Wild West levels of freedom or impunity. The digital realm is a prime example. Emerging tech like artificial intelligence and biotech might create wild frontiers. Imagine rogue AI labs operating in secret or DIY biohackers engineering organisms in a garage. Our laws can't keep up with these fast-moving innovations. In the Old West, many settlements had no official law at first, so people often took justice into their own hands. History actually shows us that the Wild West wasn't as purely chaotic as movies suggest. It wasn't gangs of outlaws that made it dangerous so much as the absence of effective law enforcement created a vacuum. Similarly, in today's tech world, when something goes wrong, say your identity is stolen by a hacker on another continent, there's often no digital sheriff to ride the rescue. We're left to fend for ourselves, protecting our data and devices as best as we can, perhaps with vigilante hackers as the new bounty hunters tracking down cyber criminals. As technology gallops ahead, large swaths of our lives, finance, data, even reality via VR may feel like frontier territory, but also perilous and unregulated. The stagecoach is racing ahead, and the posse of regulators is far behind. Another frontier-like shift is happening in the balance of power in society. In the 21st century, we see instances where individuals or private companies hold power on par with governments. If governments falter in addressing global crises, whether it's climate change, pandemics, or economic meltdowns, we could see authority fragmenting. Power might devolve to local communities, corporations, or whoever can best handle the crisis at hand. In a cyberpunk-esque scenario, you might have megacorporations providing security infrastructure, even justice, especially if public institutions can't keep up. That might sound dystopian, but it does have a historical parallel. In the Wild West, wealthy ranchers, railroad companies, and banks often became the law when official institutions were absent. They hired private enforcers or detective agencies to protect their interests, effectively wielding government-like authority. They paid bounties for vigilantes who brought in bandits or troublesome union organizers, often outgunning the weak government presence with cash and hired guns. Now let's look to the future. If, say, a massive hurricane knocks out infrastructure over a wide area, who steps in if the government can't respond fast enough? Possibly private security firms hired by insurance companies or billionaires. If we establish a mining colony on an asteroid, who makes and enforces the rules? Probably a corporation that built it, complete with its own security force. Even online, when a platform like Facebook or Twitter controls speech codes for billions of people, those companies are effectively creating and enforcing laws, like terms of service, just like private jurisdictions. We are already seeing hints of this private justice dynamic. If public governance doesn't catch up, the future could look like a patchwork of mini territories run by whoever has the resources, be it corporations controlling colonies or communities relying on local self-rule. And that is exactly how a frontier operates. Finally, there's a cultural shift pushing us toward a cowboy future. People are gradually embracing a more independent, self-reliant mindset, sometimes out of necessity. Modern life for decades made many of us comfortable and dependent on big systems. Governments, corporations, global supply chains. But recent events have shaken that trust. The pandemic showed how those systems can break down, leaving folks on their own for things like food, health, or even toilet paper. Climate change is causing more natural disasters, and sometimes communities have to survive for days without outside help. As a result, movements that emphasize self-sufficiency are on the rise. Look at the growing interest in homesteading, growing your own food, going off the grid, survival prepping, stockpiling supplies and learning survival skills, or even the hashtag van life trend, living nomadically and minimally. What is all that if not a modern echo of the pioneer spirit? It's not paranoia, well, sometimes it is, but it's people quietly saying, maybe I can't count on the big institutions to save me, so I better learn to handle things myself. And that's very frontier. Even in the job market, the gig economy has more people becoming lone riders. Economically speaking, freelancers without a long-term employer having to hustle and look out for themselves. Remote work has untethered people from offices, making it possible to move around like nomads, chasing opportunity. The stereotype of the cowboy, independent, resourceful, a bit skeptical of authority, fits a generation that has seen institutions fail them and decided to take more control of their own fate. We're not all the way there yet, but the needle has moved toward a do-it-yourself, make-your-own-rules attitude. It's easy to imagine that trend continuing, especially if future crises make governments seem even less reliable. In a very real sense, we are relearning some of the skills and attitudes our great-grandparents had on the frontier. Put all these trends together: new worlds in space, wild zones in cyberspace, power shifting into private hands, and a resurgence of frontier grit among ordinary people, and you get a picture of the future that looks an awful lot like the Old West. Not an exact copy, of course, but the feel could be strikingly similar. You travel to a boomtown on the moon, where miners backed by wealthy investors clash over lunar gold and there's no government in sight. Or you jack into a virtual network where rogue AIs and hackers carve out territories and you navigate carefully because there's no police in that digital Wild West. Or closer to home, you find yourself in a region hit by social upheaval and disaster, where communities have to form their own militias or councils to keep the peace because centralized authority has receded. In those moments you'd think, this feels like a frontier. You'd see opportunity and danger side by side, minimal law but maximum freedom. Communities improvising their own rules, charismatic leaders or warlords filling power vacuums, and everyday folks having to watch their own backs and rely on their neighbors. That's basically the template of the Old West. All this raises a burning question. When might this cowboy future actually happen? Are we on the brink of it, or is it a far-off scenario? Before we settle up and ride into the sunset, I think I really overdid it with that analogy. Let's talk timing, and the answer might not be what you expect. The reality is that it likely won't happen overnight. In fact, in the near future, we are trending into the opposite direction. The coming decade or two might actually feel more controlled and centralized, not less. Think of it as a calm before the wild storm, or maybe a tightly managed calm before things eventually get untamed again. Right now we see technology being used by governments and big organizations to tighten their grip, not to loosen it. Surveillance systems, AI monitoring, data tracking, these are empowering authorities to keep a closer watch on everything. The spread of AI-powered surveillance systems around the world already has empowered governments seeking greater control with tools that entrench non-democracy. In other words, Big Brother is getting some really high-tech binoculars. In the near term, the vibe might be less Wild West and more sheriff everywhere. Or cynically, an era of digital dragnets and corporate algorithms keeping things in in line. If advanced technology stays concentrated in the hands of a few governments, megacorporations, or individuals, it will act as a force of control rather than liberation for the average person. It's like the early days of any powerful tech. The ones in charge use it to fortify their position. So for a while, we might actually experience a tighter world. More surveillance, more rules, more algorithmic management of society. Not exactly the untamed freedom of the frontier. So when does the pendulum swing the other way? Historically, it's when technology becomes cheap and widespread enough that everyone has access. That's when centralized control starts to crack. Consider what happens when a powerful tool goes from exclusive to ubiquitous. Back in the late 90s, Napster was a centralized service for sharing music files. The authorities shut it down easily in 2001 because it had a central server and one company to sue. But what came next? Decentralized peer-to-peer networks like Gnatella and BitTorrent with no central server at all, and those were virtually impossible to shut down. There was no single switch to flip, no company HQ to raid, millions of users were directly connected to each other. The genie was out of the bottle. The Wild West of file sharing was in full swing and couldn't be corralled by lawsuits alone. The music industry had to adapt because enforcement alone couldn't put that frontier back into the bottle. Another example is encryption technology. In the early 1990s, strong encryption, the kind that lets you scramble data so well even governments can't crack it, was treated like a weapon. The US literally classified encryption software as ammunition and banned its export. Only the military and a few approved parties were supposed to have the really good crypto. But then encryption tools like PGP leaked out onto the internet. Programmers around the world started adopting them, and public demand grew. The control regime crumbled. By 1999, the US government essentially threw in the towel and announced a policy change that removed virtually all restrictions on exporting retail encryption products. Why? Because by that point, strong crypto was everywhere. Trying to restrict it was futile. The horses had left the barn and were breeding in the wild. That's what horses do, in the wild. And I think also in the stable. Anyway, in short, once advanced tech trickled down to regular folks, the authorities lost their monopoly and thus a chunk of their power. This pattern, powerful technology initially centralizing power, then eventually decentralizing it, has played out time and again. It's likely to happen with many of the emerging technologies that for now give governments and corporations the upper hand. It might take decades, but consider things like AI, biotechnology, drones, 3D printing. Today, these can be tightly controlled by those in power in some ways. But fast forward, imagine personal AIs as common as PCs, biohack labs in every town, cheap drones that anyone can deploy, or manufacturing units that can print anything on demand in your garage. When high-tech tools become as ubiquitous as smartphones, it becomes really hard for any central authority to control everyone's behavior. People become too hard to control through space and time. Power diffuses, the frontier opens up again. And let's not forget, the computing power that once filled NASA's facilities in 1969 is now in your pocket. In fact, your smartphone is more powerful than all of NASA's 1969 computers combined. The Apollo mission ran on less processing power than the phone you used to send cat videos. It took half a century for that shift, but it happened. Likewise, the cutting-edge technology of today will become the cheap, everyday tool of tomorrow. And when it does, the ability of big players to maintain a tight grip will loosen. The next Wild West could dawn at that point when technology empowers individuals and small groups to do things that only big governments or companies can do right now. So when will the future be cowboys? Only after this high-tech power flip. After the current era of centralization peaks and technology truly democratizes. This isn't a specific date on the calendar, it's a process. We might have to slog through a pretty managed surveillance-heavy period first, with AI sheriffs everywhere. But eventually the same tech spreads out and undermines that control. So the cowboy future likely isn't right around the 2030 corner, instead we'll probably see it later in the century. But if history is a guide, the centralized phase won't last forever. It will actually set the stage for its own undoing by seeding advanced capabilities among the masses. Once everyone is packing their 2080s equivalent of a 6-shooter, be it personalized AI or home fusion or, who knows what, it will be impossible for any single authority to police all those empowered individuals. That's when the lawmen of our age might fade and the outlaws and pioneers surge forward. That'll be our Wild West Redux. Now, you'll be thinking, 2080, I'll be dead by then. I wouldn't be so sure. With health tech and us becoming androids and the rich definitely not wanting to die. So let's be clever and prepare. If a Wild West style future is coming eventually, what should we do about it now? Do we just wait and see? Hell no. Any cowboy or cowgirl worth their salt prepares before the ride into unknown territory. In our final section, let's talk preparation. How can you be ready to thrive in a future that plays by frontier rules?
Master the Frontier Toolkit. Every cowboy needs the right tools, and in 2080 that might mean a solar charger, a secure VPN, and maybe even a trusty old revolver. Laser pistol is optional. Embrace a tech nomad hybrid life. The new cowboy of the future might be a techno-nomad, roaming from gig to gig, satellite phone in one hand and a lasso in the other, metaphorically speaking, we hope. Get comfortable with both high-tech and no-tech situations. Versatility is the name of the game. Cultivate a frontier mindset. Translation, get comfortable with chaos and uncertainty. A Wild West future will reward those who can keep their cool when things go sideways. Build your pause. Even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. On the frontier, community is survival. The lone wolf hero makes for great movies, but in real life, even the toughest cowboys benefit from a little backup. Stay light, stay ready. In the Old West, folks travel with only what they could carry. In the New West, consider decluttering your life and staying nimble. Being ready to ride out at a moment's notice is a classic cowboy skill worth cultivating.
So if this video made you see the future a little differently, there's more where that came from. And if you want to be ready for whatever strange frontier comes next, subscribe to Epic Opaque. It's only going to get weirder from here. Also, let me know in the comments what you would be useful for in the new sci-fi West. What would your job or role be? Just asking for a friend. Check out the other videos on this channel and consider liking this video. It does help the channel a bunch. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Can't ride a horse, can't make a fire, not intentionally at least. I don't even have a hat face. Like these faces that look great with hats. Never milked a cow. At least now I know, so I can start raising horses or riding them or whatever you do with them.